This story was written over 2,000 years ago, yet its names and images still surface in today's headlines. What does the Bible actually say about the lands and peoples we now associate with modern Iran? To answer that, we must walk the biblical map, not with the urgency of a headline chaser, but with the careful patience of a reader who knows genres, dates, and the sovereignty of God. The first stop is Genesis 10, the so-called Table of Nations. There we meet names that later readers identify with regions east of the Fertile Crescent: Madai, traditionally linked to the Medes, and Elam, the Elamites. These names place a group of peoples on the biblical map whose territories overlap, in broad historical memory, with lands historians today often associate with the Iranian plateau. This is not a modern political label. It is a genealogical marker inside a narrative that seeks to show how nations emerge after the flood. Notice how the text traces relationships and origins. That is the biblical concern, not a modern map overlay. So far, origins and identification. Next, how do these groups reappear in the story of Israel and in prophetic speech? Genesis 14 offers an early concrete appearance of Elam within the narrative of Abraham. In the episode often called The Rescue of Lot, readers find a coalition of kings led by names unfamiliar to casual readers, among them, a king of Elam. Here the Bible portrays Elam as a military actor in the ancient Near East, intersecting with the life of Abraham. The theological rhythm of the episode contrasts human power and shifting alliances with God's unfolding promise to Abraham. That tension, earthly empires moving like pieces on a board while God's promise perseveres, will recur in later texts. From genealogies and early narratives we move forward several centuries to the age when those scattered peoples coalesce into empire. Centuries later, the rise of the Medo-Persian power becomes a decisive chapter in biblical history. The Hebrew scriptures record this empire not simply as an anonymous force, but as an instrument in God's economy. Isaiah 45 famously names Cyrus by name as an instrument sent to accomplish God's purposes. Read within Isaiah, Cyrus is presented as chosen to facilitate restoration, to allow exiles to return and the temple to be rebuilt. That prophetic naming finds a historical counterpart in the decree recorded in Ezra and echoed in 2 Chronicles. The Persian ruler who permits the Jewish people to return and rebuild. The lesson is not that empire is inherently good or evil, but that God's sovereignty can make even imperial policies serve the ends of restoration. Consider how surprising that is, a foreign king, unfamiliar with Yahweh's covenant, acting to fulfill a divine purpose. It reframes how we think about the role of empires in salvation history. The biblical witness to Media and Persia continues in apocalyptic vision. In Daniel 8, the prophet offers symbolic imagery: a ram with 2 horns identified as Media and Persia, and a male goat understood as the coming Greek Empire. That vision was later read by many interpreters as forecasting the sweep of imperial transitions that actually occurred: the Medo-Persian dominance followed by the rise of Greece under Alexander. But here the genre matters. Apocalyptic language is symbolic and theological. It interprets history in cosmic terms. We should therefore respect Daniel's symbolic method and avoid forcing literal political correspondence onto every modern crisis. The ram and goat teach a pattern. Empires rise, clash, and serve the divine narrative in ways that are both frightening and disciplining. If we move from political drama to human drama, Esther's story places God's people at the heart of the Persian imperial court in Susa. The empire that expelled and later restored exiles is also the stage for a young Jewish woman who, by courage and providence, preserves her people. Esther reminds us that the imperial sphere is not monolithic. It can threaten and it can shelter. It can be venue for persecution and, paradoxically, for preservation. That same Persian cultural sphere persists into the New Testament era, helping explain why Matthew's account locates the Magi as from the East, a cultural memory of learned visitors from the wider Iranian world, bringing their gifts and witnessing Christ's birth. These episodes complicate any simplistic moral judgment about a whole people or territory. When readers turn to prophetic oracles such as Ezekiel 38, the impulse to map ancient names onto modern states grows strong. Ezekiel's oracle against Gog and Magog has, in many recent decades, been read by some as a checklist for current geopolitics. But biblical prophecy demands caution. Ezekiel writes in a particular context with imagery, symbolic geography, and theological purpose. Multiple scholarly readings exist about whom the prophet intends. Some see a symbolic enemy of God's people, others a coalition of nations that will be judged and then vindicated by God's presence. What is clear is the theological contour. God rules nations, calls them to account, and ultimately vindicates his holy name. What is unclear is the simple equation of modern political entities with the symbolic actors of prophetic oracles. The safer posture is interpretive humility rather than headline-driven certainty. Across these texts, Genesis, Isaiah, Ezra, Daniel, Esther, and echoes in Matthew, a theological pattern emerges. First, ancient names like Elam, Madai, Media, and Persia point us to peoples and polities that played diverse roles in Israel's history. Second, these roles are mixed, sometimes adversary, sometimes instrument of judgment, sometimes facilitator of restoration, sometimes a stage for preservation. Third, God's sovereignty is the theological center. God governs the rise and fall of kings and empires, often using surprising means to accomplish redemptive purposes. That is the guiding claim the Bible consistently makes. How should Christians read these passages today, especially when modern headlines conflate ancient names with contemporary states? Start with genre and context. Narrative traces origins and events. Prophecy calls for theological interpretation. Apocalyptic uses symbolism to wrestle with cosmic realities. Distinguish historical identification, territory traditionally associated with modern Iran, from direct political application to a contemporary regime. Resist the temptation to treat prophecy as a daily newspaper that predicts immediate events. Instead, allow Scripture to shape your understanding of God's sovereignty, your posture toward nations, and your practice of prayer and discernment. Practically, this means three things for a faithful reader. Study carefully, consult context, original languages if possible, and reputable scholarship that respects historical horizons. Pray with humility. Ask God for wisdom rather than certainty. Act with compassion. Avoid dehumanizing modern peoples in the name of biblical typologies. The Bible gives us theological tools to interpret history, not a checklist for modern geopolitics. The biblical fate of the territory historically associated with modern Iran, then, is not a single headline. It is a complex portrait. Ancestral names in Genesis, military actors in early narratives, imperial instruments in Isaiah and Ezra, symbolic players in Daniel, a court setting in Esther, and cultural traces in Matthew. The central theological truth is steady. Nations rise and fall within the sovereign purposes of God, and ancient Persia's portrait in Scripture is multifaceted: judge, servant, shelter, not monolithic. If you value careful, contextual biblical study, subscribe now. Thank you for following this careful journey through the Scriptures. If this helped widen your perspective, share the video and explore more in the series where we unpack biblical names, nations, and what they mean for faithful interpretation today.